Now, of course, the ruling class knows what is coming. And as I said before, they have deployed counterinsurgency. They're using the controlled media to build up and glamorize certain figures that are supposed to be regarded as leaders. These are distractions, largely, and they're disorientations. Glenn Greenwald comes to mind. Now, of course, the media are controlled by Wall Street and by the intelligence agencies. So when you get media cartels forming around Assange or Snowden, that really ought to tell you something. So the first category of these distractions is the limited hangout. Let's call it the striptease. That gets attention right away. And of course, the protagonists of this are unlikely individuals, right? Julian Assange coming from the Anne Hamilton Byrne cult, Ed Snowden coming from a past, apparently, of somebody who was very much opposed to leaks. I wanted to just remind you, there are some easy criteria, easy rules to understand what a limited hangout, when a limited hangout is going on. The first is that there's a Damascus Road conversion of the main people. Daniel Ellsberg was a hawk until he became the purveyor of the Pentagon Papers. Snowden said that leakers should be shot in the genitals until he decided that it was time for him to begin doing that. So there's a certain idea that intelligence assets are being retooled and retreaded rather than some sincere process. The chosen leaker, the chosen whistleblower, immediately becomes a media darling. Ellsberg had a media cartel immediately around him, with the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe. With Assange, it's even bigger, the Guardian, the New York Times, Der Spiegel, El País, and so forth. Snowden has devoted followers at the London Guardian, the Washington Post, and many others. All of that suspicious. The leaker, the whistleblower, tells us nothing new. The stuff that Snowden is touting, apart from a couple of code names like Prism and a few others, all of this was completely known. The European Union held hearings about this in the late 1990s. I just heard the interview of Greenwald with the committee, the relevant committee of the European Parliament. They seem to not realize that the European Parliament knew more about this than anybody in the world in 1998, 1999, when the Echelon program, that is the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, when that was first announced. The leaker, the whistleblower, tells us nothing big. No big covert operations are blown up. Ellsberg had nothing to say about the Kennedy assassination. Assange had nothing to say about 9/11. Snowden has nothing to say about the Arab Spring, the killing of Gaddafi, the destabilization of Syria, the support from the CIA to the Muslim Brotherhood, and on and on. We simply don't get any of the big stuff. It's another way of saying that what is leaked has already been carefully redacted and sanitized. These whistleblowers, so-called, prepare new covert operations. Ellsberg, with the Pentagon Papers, prepared Watergate, which was an attack on the presidency to make the oligarchs and the bankers stronger and the institutions of the United States weaker. Assange prepared the Arab Spring by denouncing the main targets. Snowden was obviously attempting to weaken Obama to the point where he would have no choice but to accept the demands of the British and the French to attack Syria, to bomb Syria so that London and Paris could reassert their colonial empires. The other goal, of course, of Assange, Snowden is attempting to carry out this ruling class strategy, whether he knows it or not, that a president is controlled in the first term because he needs money for his second election. But if he wins the second election, there's a danger that he might do something, not that Obama has, but that he might, and therefore he's got to be kept muzzled with scandals. And that is the secret of this, from Nixon to Reagan to Clinton. The president is bashed in the second term, so the oligarchy keeps him in control, if necessary, with the risk of impeachment. And finally, careers are made, right? Obviously, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald and others are making a career of this. They've become famous. Back in the days of Ellsberg, it was Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and others who built their careers around the notoriety they got as recommending that the Pentagon Papers were the real thing. Well, I've looked at the writings of Paolo Sarpi of Venice, and in particular, about 400 years ago, Sarpi wrote an opinion for the Venetian Senate. It's called Confutar Scritture Malediche. How do you refute? How do you deal with negative or lying propaganda? And Sarpi points out the way to do that is what we would call a limited hangout. The art of saying something good about somebody while you're pretending to say something bad. So if I say an intelligence agency is tapping your phone, well, that's bad. But if I could show you how the Kennedy assassination or 9/11 came about, people might be rather more indignant about those things than they are about simply snooping. And of course, I'm against snooping. It's just that I have assumed since about 1970 that every word I ever said into a telephone was immediately being taped. And I've had some experiences that indicated that at least some of the time it was being taped. Telegraph lines began to be tapped in the 1920s. There was something called the Black Chamber of the United States, which was a code-breaking group that listened in and snooped on the delegates to the Washington Naval Conference of 1920. And, of course, we have Echelon, the five powers, the Five Eyes, U.S., Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, what the French would call the Anglo-Saxon conspiracy, or which de Gaulle certainly would have. Well, Echelon, how did that come about? Just one interesting case, in addition to the Pentagon Papers, in addition to WikiLeaks, and now in addition to Snowden. Let's take a look at the Spycatcher affair. One of the ways that these incidents are used is that they can be important in reorganizing, revamping an intelligence establishment. And in the course of the 1980s, the former MI5 official Peter Wright made allegations that former head of MI5 had been a Soviet agent, and this then led to huge scandals. The book by Chapman Pincher, Their Trade is Treachery, followed by Spycatcher by Peter Wright, followed then by the Spycatcher trial and the Spycatcher affair, and so on down the line. And what was the point of all that? The British government went to Australia and tried to prevent this book from being published, and the British government was defeated. But somehow out of this, within a couple of years, the Echelon group appeared. One of the goals of this was to protect Lord Victor Rothschild from the scrutiny that was focused on him as a result of revelations concerning the famous Cambridge spy ring. Philby, MacLean, Burgess, Blunt, the art critic, and then the fifth man, who was that? Karen Cross? And some might have said, well, where did Lord Victor Rothschild fit into that? Those questions were kind of pushed aside as a result of the Spycatcher operation. And again, as I say, part of this is to prepare the creation of Echelon. So we've had any number of these events, and they all tend to follow the criteria that I've said. David Shaler of MI5 was somebody who I think revealed a covert operation that MI5 did not want revealed, which was attempts to assassinate Gaddafi of Libya already during the 1990s. And Shaler was not given the soapbox of the London Guardian, but rather subjected to some very, very destructive attacks, which caused tremendous damage to him personally. What is at stake here can be described as the action image of society, or the appeal or the attempt to dominate the imagination of rebellious youth. Youth, if they're healthy, want to rebel. But how do you rebel? Rebel against what? In the name of what? People like Assange and Snowden and others, going back to Ellsberg and others, the goal here is partially to try to capture the spirit of the age as far as those youthful rebels are concerned, and channel that back into something much less threatening and indeed useful for the ruling elites. And some of these secrets simply can't be kept forever. Another way to put it is the cult of Apollo, the bankers and spooks, that controls the cult of Dionysios, which are the wild people. So what are we left with? Is there a revolution forming here? A revolution around encryption or something like this? Well, Lenin, whatever else he was a revolutionary. And you remember his famous slogan, all power to the Soviets, peace, bread, and land. And that was effective. If we look at Snowden, what would his program be? All power to the hackers, all power to the whistleblowers, transparency, privacy, and encryption. I think you can see that that is not likely to threaten the ruling elite, because it can't appeal to about 2/3 of the people in the world who don't have the internet, and large groups inside the advanced countries. And then the next step is send in the clowns, bring in the clown car. And I mean literally, we should be playing Kabalevsky's suite from the Comedians, that hectic music that might describe what's going on. Here in the United States, we're supposed to take seriously that Jesse the Body Ventura, the failed governor of Minnesota, wants possibly to run for president, and he might do it with Howard Stern, the scabrous radio personality, as his vice presidential candidate. Could that be taken seriously? I hope not. I think it's an exercise in disorientation. In Italy, of course, we have a very successful comedian, Beppe Grillo, of the Five-Star Movement, with more than 20% of the votes. And what does he push? Décroissance, décrescita, the opposite of growth. Well, in English, that's atrophy, and not something that a society could survive. He is opposed to all infrastructure. No fast rail, no bridges, no energy production, essentially a death sentence for any country, and the negation of the lessons of the New Deal, which were bought at great cost. And of course, he does this with the John Lennon lookalike Casaleggio, the cyber guru, whispering in his ear. In France, we have Dieudonné Mbalabala. His idea seems to be that the world revolves around the Israelis, and that all politics begins by opposing the Israelis. Fine, there's plenty to oppose, but this again is not your mass traction economic demand. Interestingly enough, Grillo and Dieudonné are both making waves by a certain gesture, which they're attempting to use as their signature gesticulation. Well, in the case of Grillo, it's that obscene gesture that's been around in Naples, I guess, since the Roman Empire, And with Dieudonné, it's a variation on the Roman salute that Mussolini might have recognized. So these are examples of comedians that are not exactly funny. Russell Brand, the decadent personality of Hollywood and such places, is getting a lot of play in The New Statesman, that he's a leader of some coming revolution. The New Statesman, of course, pretty much in the orbit of the House of Rothschild. If we look at Max Kaiser, the genial television host, he and his partner apparently believe that the revolution is the Bitcoin, that there's going to be a Bitcoin revolution and that the revolution is going to be encrypted. I would submit that this is folly. What is their idea of a revolution? Again, for Ventura, it's the free market that never was on land or sea. For Howard Stern, it's some kind of, perhaps an orgy or a flesh pile. For Grillo, no public money goes to politicians. All the parliament has to serve for free. They better be rich, I guess, under Grillo's system. The Dieudonné, it's the negation of the Israelis and all their works. For Russell Brand, it's the total consciousness revolution circa 1968. I'm sure Cohn-Bendit can give him some treatments. And again, for Max Kaiser, it's funny money, the funny money revolution. Some people say community currency. No, that's not radical. It's got to be the Bitcoin. Well, some reality here. Societies do not open up to revolutionary change on the basis of these caprices, right? It's not a subjective utopia. It's rather something much more grim. The society might turn to revolution when it feels that it cannot survive any other way. Revolution should not be and is not a utopian wish list. It is a plan for survival. It is a desperate struggle for the society to survive. It is not a smorgasbord of radical subjectivists, but it has to worry about things like living standards, longevity, production, nutrition, demographics, and so forth. The moment when revolution becomes possible is when demands that are seen as fair, reasonable, and self-evident, something like the Wall Street sales tax or nationalizing the Fed, when those are seen as perfectly reasonable, even though they essentially destroy the overweening power of the financier oligarchs, that is when revolution becomes possible. And that is, I think, the importance of Credico bringing the Tax Wall Street message into the New York campaign. You notice that the Tax Wall Street Party also had a comedian, but this was the best comedian in the field, tremendously superior to these Brand X comedians. Revolution needs science. We need to have energy sources that will allow a greater energy flux density. Windmills and solar cells cannot do it. Look at the base load of electricity in particular, and look at what the base load would be if we went from stagnation to recovery. You'll begin to get the idea of what is demanded. We've gone from wood to coal to oil to nuclear, and now it's time for another step. It's time for thermonuclear. We have the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, which is rapidly progressing towards a new kind of tokamak fusion test reactor after the two previous ones were shut down by budget cuts. There is now hope that the United States will once again assert an important role in that fusion area. And we have the ITER, I-T-E-R, which is being built in the south of France. It's going to be, I think, the fusion reactor that makes the leap to break even, where the energy coming in is equal to the energy going out, and then beyond break even to actual energy production and set the stage for a pilot commercial reactor. In this case, the raw material is not uranium or plutonium. It's not a hydrocarbon, nothing to do with carbon. It's just H2O. It's water. That's the most plentiful substance, or one of the most plentiful substances on this planet. And it would mean an era of energy abundance of the type that we've never seen before, and the ability to get energy flux density of the fusion variety, not fission, but fusion, which would be head and shoulders above anything achieved so far. And it also avoids the entire carbon demagogy pushed by Al Gore and other elitists. So that's the hope, and that can be coming soon, beyond ananke, beyond scarcity, beyond penury. This can be financed as a science driver, partly on budget, but to a very large degree off budget, with 0% credit from a nationalized Fed. The space program here in the United States is in dire condition. If Kennedy's signature program was the moonshot, Obama's signature contribution here is that there is no more manned U.S. space program simply based in this country. We congratulate China for sending a probe to the moon. India is making rapid strides in this area. Of course, the United States has had a few trump cards to play: the Mars Curiosity rover, the Cassini space probe, which has sent back very dramatic pictures just in the last month or so. And we hear repeated milestones of the Voyager spacecraft, as it has now gotten about 12 billion miles from the Earth and is going into interplanetary and indeed interstellar space. So all of this is going on, but it has got to be accelerated using that 0% 100-year credit as needed. The other science driver that's got to be proposed and driven forward is the biomedical research. The only way to save money on healthcare is to find cures, cure cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and all the rest. Cures are the way to save money without violating the human dignity of the patients involved. The National Institutes of Health has been devastated by the lunatic Tea Party faction of the Republican Party with cooperation from Obama. This notion of a sequester has, according to some accounts, set back U.S. biomedical research for about 20 years. And that means that if you find yourself in need of those cures that won't be there, you can thank the Tea Party in particular. Now that leaves us with the domestic U.S. strategy. What's to be done? It's basically easy. Destroy the Republican Party in place. This is now a party with no saving graces. It has a mainstream reactionary faction and a fascistoid Tea Party faction. And this is a definite threat to the future existence of the United States. The Republican Party has a future perhaps as a regional party for racists, reactionaries in the Deep South, in the Intermountain West, in rural areas. But other than that, they must never be allowed to take over the White House again. Of course, the Democratic Party, not much better. In this case, though, we can see the potential for a split. On the one hand, the Wall Street Democrats, Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Schumer, Durbin, Pelosi, and others. But there's also something not quite the same, not quite as bad as that. The populist or the pro-labor people, Elizabeth Warren, Sherrod Brown, Conyers, DeFazio, Marcy Kaptur, and so on down the line. If the Republican Party were to cease to exist, there's every potential for the Democrats to split into two parts. And we're seeing that polemic from one group in particular that is against populism, and other groups in the Democratic Party that are pro-populism. And the idea of using the minimum wage as an issue is right now one of the ways you can tell who's who. Elizabeth Warren has done some interesting things. The 0.75% refinancing of student loans paid for through the discount window by the Federal Reserve was, of course, the only proposal that I can remember in my lifetime for the Congress to assert control over the Fed and tell them what they must do. So that's a step forward. Unfortunately, she seems to have dropped this entire thing. But certainly, a world where Elizabeth Warren is the Democratic candidate is not as bad as the world where Hillary Clinton is the Democratic candidate. In all of this, the United Front Against Austerity and the Tax Wall Street Party would see itself as a catalyst. Now, a word about what that would mean, what that would look like in Europe. When I started off in 1971 to organize the European Labour Party and the various versions of this in the various countries, the most obvious axiom was that only European-wide, continent-wide, EU-wide organizing could be taken seriously. Precious few people in Europe seem to have gotten this point, at least on the positive side. What you need is a European-wide movement to seize control of the European Central Bank, kick out the Merkel people, kick out Mario Draghi, and so forth, and begin doing the same thing. 5 trillion euros would be a good start, and start then with the creation of 40 million new productive jobs. Look at those dramatic works of infrastructure, the bridge tunnel from Gibraltar, from Spain to Africa, from Calabria to Messina to Tunisia. There's a railroad that's got to be built from Cairo to the Cape, from Dakar to Djibouti, around all the periphery of Africa, and then with those other two crossing right in the middle, there's also the Congo and Nile internal waterway with needing the full Tennessee Valley Authority treatment. And this is the way that one must go. The only way you get anywhere near that is to overcome the narrow fragmentation of country-by-country organizing and attempt to do that on the basis of a European-wide movement. Even we note that Le Pen, Madame Le Pen of the French National Front, is attempting to make an alliance with the xenophobic forces of the Netherlands and some other countries. Of course, the British xenophobes are so xenophobic that they don't want to be part of any continental European operation. So the lesson, though, is clear. If you want to get anywhere, it's got to be continent-wide. I would also point to the recent report from the distinguished Italian economist, a Keynesian, but one of the better ones, Giulio Sapelli, has pointed out that Professor Giuseppe Guarino and Romano Prodi, veteran of the European Commission, are talking about a bloc of France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal to contest the Merkel domination and the Bundesbank domination of the European Central Bank. So it's the same principle. Europeanize, in this case, the European Central Bank. Take it out of the hands of the Bilderberger people and put it into the hands of European working people and their elected representatives. Obviously, going with that would be a 1% Euro Tobin, which has to be used not for ecological or radical environmentalist purposes, but first and foremost for people, for working families. Now, we've just had this brush with a general war in the Middle East in September of this year. The danger remains acute. As a matter of fact, if we look back, the magazines this week already are recalling that we're approaching the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I in July, August of 1914. And unfortunately, there's a kind of tendency here which is very disturbing. We can go back at least 600 years to go no further to see that at this point in a new century, this is when large conflagrations seem to break out. If we go back to the early 1400s, France and England were locked in the 100 Years' War. In 1509, we had at the beginning of a world war at the beginning of the modern era, the War of the League of Cambrai, with alliance patterns that are far too complicated to talk about here. In 1618, we have the outbreak of the worst European war in proportional terms ever, the 30 Years' War. In the early 1700s, Europe was gripped by the War of the Spanish Succession, terrible defeat for France. In the early 1800s, of course, it's the Napoleonic Wars, the Russia 1812 campaign, and others. Then, of course, 1914 and the catastrophic events of the First World War. So where are we now? We've just had that brush with a general war, and we noticed that inside the U.S. regime, people like Obama, Kerry, Susan Rice, and CIA boss Brennan, none of them were resisting it, and apparently Brennan and Rice were very much in favor. And this is what we read in the recent revelations of Seymour Hersh. Now, fortunately, there were statesmen on the scene. Putin and Lavrov of Russia certainly qualify as eminent statesmen. And we recall, as I tried to at the National Press Club in September, that Russia has provided vital assistance for the United States. The League of the Armed Neutrality, back in the Revolutionary War by Catherine the Great, the Russian fleets sent to New York and San Francisco in 1863, and I urge you to take a look at my lecture about that, which is in the C-SPAN video library. You can just find it under Tarpley, the most recent. In World War II, of course, it was Russia, the Soviet Union, that took the brunt of the fighting. After 9/11, the restraint and wisdom of Putin was important to avoid making that into a general conflagration. And then today, and it's interesting that this is that the response to this is hysteria from the Western elites. And we notice with grave concern the recent bombing incidents in cities like Pyatigorsk, in Volgograd, and elsewhere. We have to wonder what NATO intelligence had to do with this. Go back to the Chechen terrorism in Boston at the beginning of last September, and we look at such figures as Uncle Ruslan, who's had married the daughter of Graham Fuller of the U.S. intelligence community. This is very suspicious. And of course, we have Ilyas Akhmadov of the Chechen rebels operating here in Washington, D.C. We recall that Basayev, one of the main Chechen terrorist leaders, was widely regarded to be a CIA agent. Doku Umarov, perhaps something similar. So this is extremely dangerous, and it reminds us of those 6 wars breaking out at about this point in the century. So the answers to this are stop the anti-Russian campaign, hands off Syria, hands off Ukraine. The lesson of 1914 for Europe, for the French and the British in particular. The American people, I think, have gotten some idea of this lesson. Imperialism does not work. Imperialist wars are futile and suicidal. So in conclusion, the mass strike has been abroad in the West since Wisconsin, February 2011. That, really much more than Occupy Wall Street, was the beginning of a possible awakening of the American people and others around the world. That was essentially a mass strike of an entire state against the neo-fascist policies of the Republican Governor Walker. But remember again, the mass strike upsurge by itself solves nothing. It is only an opportunity. There are tasks and deadlines which history poses, and if they are not met, then the consequences are nothing short of catastrophic. When revolutions fail, quand les révolutions ratent, that is when you have to begin worrying about terrible, terrible events. So I would encourage people to realize that even lacking organization, as we do, but even lacking large-scale organization, small groups, if they're decisive and if they have clear ideas, they can intervene to provide direction. Anarchist methods will not work. Trade union methods will also not work. It's time to begin pushing aside the mushheads, the left liberals, the anarchists, the bureaucrats, the wreckers, the saboteurs, and so on down the line. It's important that there not be any facilitators. The revolution will not be encrypted. It will not be facilitated. I call your attention once again to the web pages of the United Front Against Austerity and to the Tax Wall Street Party. The big job in 2014 is to build those. There will be candidates in a number of states for federal office and for state office. One of the greatest needs is to extend this into Europe. We need a network across the European Union and beyond, animated by these same ideas of the United Front against austerity. And of course, things begin in the springtime. And the springtime is essentially now, as we saw in 1848, as we saw in 2011. The springtime begins in January all around the Mediterranean. So it's upon us. Go take a look at my website, tarpley.net, the United Front Against Austerity, and the Tax Wall Street Party. We are now approaching opportunities that must be realized. They must be used. Don't waste them. And I invite all persons of goodwill to contribute to this positive outcome in any way possible on the basis of program, organization, leadership, and strategy. Human civilization is threatened as never before. It's time to get on the World Historical Scoreboard, and I'm hoping that many will take up this challenge. Thank you very much, and of course, Happy New Year, happy 2014. Let's make it a year in which we dig our way further out of this long reactionary nightmare which many parts of the world have been experiencing for decades. Thank you very much for your kind attention.